am, wherever you are out in the world. We're really excited to see everyone here for the second of our masterclass series that the Innovation Growth Lab and the Conference of Field Experiments and Strategy has put together. We had awesome turnout on the first one. It looks like we've got awesome turnout for the second one. And we're seeing a lot of people rewatching the videos and diving deep. So really excited to have you here today. My name is Rem Koning. I'm a professor at HBS. I'm seeing some familiar names from last time we did this, some new names as well. So thank you for joining us. We're going to have Liz and Yana here from the West Coast, from UCLA and UCSD. And they're going to walk us through some of the experiments they've run, what they think about, share their knowledge with you. I'll walk through those in a little bit more detail right now, but it's exciting to see we switched from the Zoom webinar format to the regular format. So hey, Diego, I see your face right below mine. So that's the first one. How's it going?
Hey, Ren.
But it's nice to see, literally see familiar faces. Understand if you want the video off because it's the wrong time or whatever it is, particularly during the first sort of 60 minutes. Yes, if you want to leave your video on, you're interactive, that's great. If you need to turn it off because you're taking care of a kid or whatever it is, we completely understand. The last 30 minutes, we'll have a Q&A, and I'd ask if you are asking a question, if possible, it would be great to turn on your video, ask that question. If not, totally understand. But that'll be for the last 30 minutes. So with that, let me just put up some slides here. Share my screen, desktop 3. You're just going to see the big, there we go. And we'll go slideshow, make that look nice. Great. So here's where we are. We finished the first one, which was how to set up your first field experiment. Now we're diving into these specific master classes, with just phenomenal guests. Today we have Liz, who's going to be studying about team production with field experiments. Yana, I think, is going to be talking about more than pre and post-mortem of experimental design, but I don't have her full title yet. I will let her share that with you. So something to stick around with. After today, in a week, we're going to have Chiara Spina from INSEAD and Thomas Asterow from HEC. Chiara is going to be talking about experimenting with the scientific approach. And then Thomas is going to be talking about something that we should all know, which is the importance of power, which really does matter. And giving a master class on that was something that I think is hard to really think through, partly because power is hard. And so he's going to give you some tips and tricks on how to make sure you can identify and get the standard errors that you would like. Then we're going to go to two speakers who are recent PhD students and postdocs who are starting faculty positions. One is George Ward, who's going to be starting at INSEAD. One is my student, Nick Otis, who will be joining the University of Toronto. And they're going to be talking how they, as postdocs and as PhD students, built pretty phenomenal experiments. George is going to talk about an experiment he did at scale. Nick is going to talk about using AI and using that as part of your experiments. He did a number of really cool experiments evaluating the impact of AI on entrepreneurial performance, though, to full disclosure, I'm biased as I'm a co-author on one of those. You won't want to miss that, particularly for the students in the room, because I think it shows what you can build, even if you are not a professor, you don't have RAs. I think you can do a lot. We're then going to move into talks by Jackie Lane and Florian Engelmeyer. Jackie's going to talk about how you build a team to run an experiment, not how you experiment with teams, how you actually build the team you need to do that. She's worked with some phenomenal and very large teams, which is often a really good way to start learning how to run an experiment, is to join a team of folks who already have these resources. And then Florian is going to talk about experimenting with teams and organizations. Florian's an absolutely fantastic organizational economist and has some really clever sites for his experiments, including running experiments in escape rooms. But I'll let him tell you more about that. Our final session, which we just confirmed, is going to be a live feedback session. So if you want feedback on your experimental ideas, a week before April 7th, we're going to ask you to submit the strategy experimentation canvas that we walked through last week to us. You're going to submit that canvas, and then we're going to have people share their canvases live on the Zoom. The whole audience is going to give you feedback. Me, Sherrick, and Hunjin are also going to give you feedback. Great way to get feedback on your experiment, but also maybe get connected to folks who can help you run it, or to an organization that might be interested in testing the ideas that you're thinking about. So really excited about that one. We are going to prioritize people who show up for all the sessions for that last one. So please attend as many of these as you can. We're really excited to have you there. Next week, I'm going to be talking a little bit more about the Conference on Field Experiments and Strategy, the in-person one. Just to give you a preview, that's going to be having happening in San Francisco in October. We've got some of the stuff that I know folks love. The idea sessions, the paper presentations we're bringing back. We're also going to be launching something new. So stay tuned for that. We'll be talking about more over the next couple weeks. But look out in your inboxes for a call for paper and ideas. And so with that said, let me tell you a little bit more on housekeeping. I jumped the shark there a little bit. Let me go over the rules for our session. We're going to start with Liz. Liz is going to go for about 25 minutes. As Liz is talking, the most important thing I can emphasize is we want this to be participatory and we want it to be fun. So in the chat in Zoom, use the chat features, ask questions, upvote, downvote, leave comments, right? Leave tangential ideas that you've got. I think that chat can be an incredible repository to sort of help us get to know one another, even though we're all over the world. Those questions, and we'll tee up our Q&A at the end. If you have a burning question, so Liz is talking and she mentioned something like RCT, and you're like, I don't know what an RCT is. Ask in chat, raise your hand. We can blurt some of those questions out to make sure we're all on the same page. After Liz goes for about 25 minutes, we're going to move over to Yana. Yana's going to present for about 25. We're going to leave them 30 minutes for questions at the end. I'll call on some people based off what I see in the chat that are really interesting, really good, really awesome, intriguing questions. You'll also have a chance there just to ask new questions as well by using the raise your hand feature. I'll call on you to ask your question. If for whatever reason you can't ask, you're somewhere that's really noisy, you're out at dinner, whatever it is, feel free just to note it in the chat and say, I can't ask this, could you ask it for me? And I will speak on your behalf. But we love hearing from all of you live. So those sort of the rules of the game. Thank you for being here. We're at nearly 100 people on this call, which is just phenomenal. And with that, Liz, I'm going to turn it over to you. The floor is yours. Thank you so much for being here.
Amazing. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Rem. Thanks, IGL. Thanks, Anna, for having me. I'm so excited to get to talk about this topic with all of you. I'm super excited for your questions. And yeah, as Rem said, ask away. Here we go. Can you see that properly? Okay, amazing. So I'm going to be talking about studying team production with field experiments, one of my favorite topics. So I just want to start by talking about why field experiments could be useful for studying team production. And field experiments are not useful for studying everything. Some things are much better studied with lab experiments, administrative data, theory, simulations. But the thing that I love the most about field experiments, and the reason I started running them even in my during my PhD, is that they allow me to study questions that I think are important rather than questions that I have the data to address. So I get to think about things that I'm very motivated by, and that excites me. I think that the space that field experiments are useful for in team performance and organizational performance more generally are cases where direct performance measures are hard to access. So in strategy, we really care about like the performance of a firm or of whatever unit we're studying. And performance is also often hard to access, like profit, for example. Similarly, in administrative data, it can be really hard to get comparable kind of large number of teams or organizations, especially for creative work. So there's, great administrative data that has like the firm as the unit, for example, of observation, or the individual as the unit of observation, but it's relatively hard to get data with the team being the unit of observation in administrative cases. And then similarly, it's hard to find that large number of teams with plausibly exogenous variation on an interesting dimension. So, field experiments allow you to do that, and that's really fun. I want to emphasize the interesting variation. So exogenous variation on its own is not necessarily worth studying. The variation should be interesting relative to what we care about. And then even if you have, plausibly exogenous and interesting variation, you may not at the same time be able to observe the performance effects of that variation. And with experiments, you get to do all these things together. So that's why I love running them. Although, they raise my stress level immensely. I get to study things that I think are important. And I think that's like what, the reason to run field experiments at the end of the day. Okay, so where to start? Of course, the first thing to think about is what your research objective is. That's a given. I think that starting with a research objective rather than like an opportunity leads to better outcomes. So you might be confronted with an opportunity to work with an organization or to partner with a group, and they might be interested in a given research question, and it might feel like very exciting to get to work with them. But often the research questions that organizations, in my experience, that organizations are first interested in are not necessarily ones that are like theoretically relevant, and or are not ones they can actually feasibly test. So I think, great to have an opportunity, but making sure that you really go back and start with, well, what's interesting about this setting? Or, without an opportunity in front of you, thinking about what am I most motivated to study? So, as an example, my job market paper, when I was a PhD student, I was really excited about um, global teams. So, teams working together across countries. I thought this was like very exciting for a number of reasons. For example, it gave new work opportunities to people in middle income countries. I thought that was really exciting. It expanded the pool of workers that firms could hire from, which could have really meaningful productivity implications. We could get better problem solving. There's so many things about this that I was interested in, but what I was really worried about is whether these teams could effectively coordinate given like language differences and cultural differences. And so that's what I decided I wanted to study. And then I looked for a setting to study that. So starting from like, what do I really care about? What am I going to be excited about, no matter what the outcome of the experiment is really critical. So that's the start. Start with the big picture. What do I care about? You can, based on what you see in the world, conversations, existing theory. And then the second thing I would say is think through whether there's sufficient theoretical or empirical uncertainty to justify running an RCT. Field experiments or randomized control trials are expensive, typically relative to administrative data. They can take a lot of time. You might have to wait like 2 years to get relevant outcome data or more. So really think through like, is this something that's sufficiently important that I can justify using resources for this instead of whatever else I could use resources for? So for example, if there really is no theoretical ambiguity, then maybe it's not worth running an RCT. If it's just so clear what the answer to the question is, you're 95% sure that it's going to go in one direction. Maybe that's not the right space to run an RCT in. I think where RCTs are super interesting are where there's a lot of ambiguity. And the other upside of testing a question with a lot of ambiguity is that no matter what results you get, you're going to have an interesting result. So that helps too, because once you have your data, there's not much more you can do. So thinking about ambiguous questions that are going to be interesting either way, like even a null would be interesting theoretically, for example. And then think through what would the ideal experiment be. You're not going to be able to run the ideal. I mean, I've never been able to run an ideal experiment. There's trade-offs. Power limits what we can do in many cases, budgets and so on. But I think starting from the ideal experiment is useful because then you can see how close to it you can get. And then once you have that down, you kind of think this is kind of, I have an idea of what a realistic experiment could be, something feasible that addresses a question that I'm super excited about, that is theoretically relevant given the literature and given the world. Then we want to think through where should we be testing this. And so one question to start with is like, do I have to run this within an organization? Do I need a partner firm or partner organization? Because my question only makes sense in the context of people who already work together, for example, or within a given like structure or established culture. Um, and then if so, what is the ideal organization? And you should feel really comfortable with just reaching out to organizations to see if they want to work with you. One of my studies that ended up not working out within the organization I initially reached out to, but led to a subsequent one. I initially reached out to an organization, a firm that I was alerted to in reading like Glamour magazine on a plane ride, and it was just this cool firm that was like this woman was founded this really interesting firm doing something that I really cared about. I reached out to her. She was like, come out to Chicago, that's cool, let's do it. And that was just a total cold call that led me down like a wonderful path. So keep your eyes and ears open. Don't hesitate to reach out. People who run companies or manage companies are interested in what they do. So of course the worst that can happen is a no. Um, but before you send that email or make that call, it's important to think through why this might be interesting to them. So a question that's like, let's see how bad you are, might not be like of interest to them. They have no real incentive to demonstrate that they're terrible. But there are a lot of questions like, should you be managing this way or that way? And it's theoretically ambiguous which one you should be doing. That might be an easy sell if they want to improve their performance. So thinking through the email you send, and I've had several cases where the first email I sent was kind of like a no, and then 2 months later, 3 months later, they reached back out and said, actually, we've been thinking about that, and I think it would be useful. So um yeah, don't hesitate. But then of course, like a more direct approach, if you don't have to run it in an established organization, is to potentially set up your own little mini organization, especially with the unit of observation being teams rather than firms. Teams can be put together relatively quickly. And if you don't need people to have had an existing relationship, for example, for your research question to make sense, then this might be feasible. And within this, if you decide you can do this, you can, act as an employer or hire an implementation partner to act as an employer, thinking through, do you need a partner or not? What role would that partner play? And so on. So thinking hard about this, and I know that especially if you're in your PhD studies right now, time is of the essence. But getting the research setting right is essentially, I mean, after getting an interesting research question, I think like the most important part of the design process. Okay, so some tips for your research setting, I think, because again, I think this is like sometimes overlooked. And once you run your study, you can't go back. So it's really worth thinking hard up front. And something else to remember, especially if you're like worried about time, is that once you run your experiment, the analysis is going to go very fast. So like putting in the time up front is really worthwhile, as opposed to like administrative data or observational data, where the upfront stuff is kind of very minimal relative to the post data access part. I think the experiment is like the opposite, especially because you're going to pre-register your analysis. There's very little decisions to be made after the experiment has been run. So making all the right decisions in advance is really important. Inevitably, you're going to look back given your results and say, oh, I wish we had done this. But at least ex ante, you want to feel like you have the right design, the right setting, and the right question. So some considerations that I think a lot about are what type of task is going to be best for getting at this research question. So in teams, you're typically studying something they're working on, and you're trying to figure out how, their approach to working on that or whatever it is impacts performance. And so that thing they're working on is really important because, whether you're addressing something interesting or not depends on whether the thing they're working on is relevant given your research question. I like to study creative work. That's like my interest. And so ensuring that in any context, I'm studying teams working on something creative is really, really important. And I think about questions that are kind of mostly only relevant for creative work. And, the way to manage teams working on routine tasks is, at least theoretically, quite different than the way to manage teams that are working on creative tasks. So it's important to get the task right. The other question you might ask is like, how much interdependence do we want in the task when we're thinking about teams? So one example would be, we want a task where, the team workers on the team are only working together. The coordination is like constant. So every decision they make, every output, everything they're doing together. So they're fully interdependent. Another example would be like no interdependence, where they're essentially working, their each of their inputs is critical for the joint output, but they never have to link those inputs together. And there's like no interdependence. Typically, I study something in the middle, which is more typical of creative tasks, where we have like some individual thought and then some joint effort. But thinking that through is really important. And then team size is another like really challenging thing, I think, in team RCTs. Teams are so complex. Like what goes on in teams, there's so many things that goes on in teams, and they get more complex the bigger they get. We know that from psychology and from really great lab experiments, that larger teams are just very complex relative to pairs of workers. As a result, because I am, mostly interested in, although as you'll see, there's an exception, one of my papers has an exception to this, and kind of like the microdynamics of teams, I really want to be able to identify the mechanisms that underlie my intention to treat effects or my average treatment effects. And mechanisms, in my experience, are hard to identify in complex teams because there's so much going on. So I have leaned towards studying pairs. The downside of that, of course, is that most teams are not pairs in reality, especially for creative work. And so thinking through that trade-off, like what am I trading off in generalizability in order to identify the mechanism? So that those are like big questions. And in some, journals, or some, depending where you submit your work, you might even get the feedback that a pair is not even a team to begin with, and then you're not studying teams at all. And that's a common piece of feedback I've gotten. Nonetheless, I've, in what I've run, I think that the pair, by being the simplest form of a team, gives us like a lower bound on things like coordination costs, or low powered incentives or something like that. But you need to be clear about why you're making the trade off you're making. The other question is a work setting in teams. This can be really important in some depending on your research question. In-person, face-to-face work might be really essential. So you might need to like see facial, I don't know, depending on what you're studying, like how do competitive incentives impact coordination? And you might, we kind of have an idea of that given the existing literature, but you might be especially interested in the dimension that of like the mechanism through which it impacts negative facial expressions. I don't know, for example. And then you really want face-to-face work. In other cases, online work might work better because, for example, you might want cross-border teams, people working in different countries, or you might be interested in remote work or something like that. Office layout might be important too. Like I said in the previous slide, thinking about if new teams is viable for what you're testing, or you really need people to have an existing relationship, that's an important consideration. The relationship that the employers have with the employees have with the manager might be important. So if you really need there to be existing trust between the manager and employees, you might need an established organization where the manager implementing the RCT knows the workers already and there's trust. In other cases, you might not need that. In some, you might want like a self-managed team and you don't want a manager at all. Other features of the organization that might matter: incentive design, culture, the industry, depending on your research question. And then critically, I'm going to spend more time on this in a subsequent slide. What are you going to be able to measure? What does your setting allow you to measure? Something nice, for example, about online settings. Something like a reason I've enjoyed working in online settings is you can observe a lot when people are doing all their work online. You can observe their conversations, their mouse clicks, tons of stuff. But of course, that trades off some other things we might care about. I think thinking through what you need to be able to observe to address your research question is really important. And then, of course, when you're thinking about your research, underlying kind of everything I've said is thinking through these trade-offs between generalizability and mechanism identification. I think that is like the key trade-off I've faced in thinking through how representative do I want my setting to be versus how much does the mechanism driving my results matter. And I think that depends on the research question. The more we already know about a research topic, I think the more important generalizability becomes. But in very novel questions where we really have no clue what might be going on, maybe the mechanism is more important. So these are things to think about. I also want to emphasize that, like, I don't know of a single empirical study that has full generalizability. There's some effort in development economics to run RCTs that address general equilibrium effects, and I think that's super interesting. I could imagine us doing something like industry-wide effect or something, but for the most part, strategy empirical studies do not have perfect generalizability, and so making sure that you place your RCT in the context of what people care about is important. And I think really here, just be aware of the trade-offs you're making. Okay, so here's an example. I wanted to, so the two examples I'm providing are examples that I participated in. I think that gives me a better understanding of the trade-offs we thought through. But of course, these are not like necessarily ideal examples or anything like that. Okay, so this first paper, heat and team production, we wanted to see if, so there's existing body of literature that shows a negative impact of heat, warm temperatures on individual productivity, especially in manual labor tasks, which I think is relatively obvious, but even on some cognitive tasks. And then there's this literature on conflict and heat, that heat in like the political economy literature, that heat increases the likelihood of conflict. But there is nothing on like work teams. So individual workers or big groups, but nothing on work teams. So we thought, let's study if this like conflict impact of heat translates into like the work environment. And because most work occurs in teams, if it does, this might mean that the impact of heat on productivity might be even worse than we thought, because we were only focused on the individual. If there's like some additional effect on teams, it might be even worse. So this was the question we were interested in studying. So what we needed for this is obviously temperature variation. We needed to compare people working in warmer and cooler temperatures on the same task, so we could compare productivity. The other thing we wanted to hold constant the productivity impacts of heat on a given task among individuals. Because suppose we saw, if we only had teams working in heat, teams working in less heat, and we saw that teams working in heat perform worse, we might say, well, that's because we already know individuals perform worse in heat. But what we were really interested in was the additional effect of heat on teams relative to individuals. So we wanted to do a 2x2, where we had individuals in like control temperature, individuals in warm, teams in control, teams in warm. And then we get this diff and diff that would give us the differential effect of heat on teams relative to individuals. So that was important. We wanted it to be cognitively challenging. It had to be like a creative task, because that's what we're interested in, not the manual aspect of work. And again, holding task constant for all participants. So we really didn't feel we could get all these features in an existing organization. We didn't feel we could convince a manager to do this with a large number of their workers. But we also didn't think that the fundamental causal effect of heat on teamwork is specific to an existing organization. What we were really interested in was this fundamental, no one had studied this, does heat matter for teams? And then we could imagine it's going to matter more or less depending on how teams are managed. I think certainly that's almost surely true. But we thought just establishing this first effect was worthwhile. And so we decided to work with an implementation partner in DACA to help us recruit computer science students in the senior years of their undergraduate degree to work on this task. And we had pair programming versus independent programming, and then we varied temperature. An important question we had here was like, what is reasonable for temperature variation? It's probably not reasonable to put people in a room and crank up the thermometer to like 100 degrees Fahrenheit, right? Like that's ethically questionable and also like really not very realistic. So what we thought is we wanted all room temperatures to be lower than the outdoor temperature, which is what led us to DACA. They have a great supply of computer science students who work for, relatively affordable wages, and it's hot. And so even a warm indoor temperature could still be below the outdoor temperature. And this would be like ethically reasonable and also kind of natural. And the penetration of air conditioning in DACA is limited. And so, people are used to working in warm temps. The other thing this gave us is we thought a major pushback against any result we had would be that, oh, but teams adapt. People adapt to heat. So we thought if we run this in an already very hot place and find effects, then it suggests like just biological adaptation may not be enough. So that's like a lot of what led us to the setting we ended up with. But I think it also shows like how many mini trade-offs you're making in this process and why thinking each one through is so important. Initially, because we really thought management practices might be able to mitigate any effects of heat, we did have a incentive treatment arm of the study, but we didn't end up thinking we had enough power. I'm thrilled that Professor Astero is coming to talk about power, because if you don't make that trade-off at the beginning, you're going to end up with data that can do nothing. So thinking about power is really important. Of course, ideally, we'd run 800 arms with all
Liz,
possible.
what were the treatment arms again? Sorry, just quick clarifying question.
Thank you, Ram. Okay, so we had a 2x2 temperature variation. So the temperature variation we ended up having was 24 degrees Celsius was the control room, and 29 degrees Celsius was the treatment room. And we think even 24 here is pretty warm for those of you who think in Celsius, but there that was quite cool. And then pair programming versus independent programming. And then it was a 2x2. So we had independent workers in 24 degrees, independent workers in 29 degrees, teams in 24, teams in 29. And then we thought we'd do an additional treatment on top of that varied whether people were given constant bonuses for output or increasing bonuses over time, given that the effort cost associated with heat, we think, is increasing over time as it accumulates. But we didn't run that in the end. Thanks, Ram. Okay, so why did we think this was something to study with a field experiment to begin with? Yeah, as I said, it's really hard to address the selection issues associated with heat in teams in observational data. So the first, and this is independently a very interesting question. It was just not what we wanted to answer. People might just not work when it's warm. So people are more likely to get sick when it's warm, they're uncomfortable. And so the people that are most able to thrive in heat are the ones we capture. And that's interesting. I think that if we allowing for selection would have been interesting if we already knew the fundamental cause of heat in teams. Similarly, people might be like, I only want to work with my best friend when it's hot because I know we can manage conflict. And so you might see that there's no additional conflict, but it's like because you're working with your best friend. And selection into teams, as we'll see, is something you need to address in some contexts. In your RCT, you might want to allow self-selection into teams, and others you might want random assignment into teams. So that's an important consideration. We wanted random assignment for this reason. We didn't want people to self-manage adaptation to warmth. Again, people might just not work in teams. Maybe they work, but not in teams when it's warm. And so even though they're assigned to a team by their manager, they're in fact working independently on hot days. And then similarly, managers might introduce adaptations, and we've seen this in other work. Great work by my colleague at USC and one of my former colleagues here, and I'm blanking on names, that shows that managers do adapt to heat in how they manage, but they're often hard to observe. These adaptations are hard to observe. And so we thought we didn't really want to claim to be able to observe those things. Okay, for example, observational data on the precise temperature of indoor rooms is hard to access, whereas in our field experiment, we could measure the temperature of the room. Okay, so as I said, I think each of those responses to heat are super interesting. Like, how do managers adapt? That's a fascinating question. It was just not the question we wanted to answer. And we felt to answer our question, we had to run a field experiment. Okay, and then a second sorry, my voice. Just as the paper is R&R, Review of Economics and Statistics, we found that heat does differentially impact teams in a negative way. And so, yeah, it ended up being really interesting and a really fun project to work on. A second example is one in which we thought selection into teams was really important. So we didn't want random team assignment. And this is this paper called The Effects of Prize Structures on Innovative Performance. And the goal here was to understand how incentive design affects innovation in real world settings. There was already a lot of like lab work or kind of lab in the field work showing that incentives matters for innovation, and also like administrative data work that showed that. And we felt like the gap was like, well, what about when there are high powered incentives, career incentives, reputational incentives, lots of money involved in real, like in a real context? How do people respond to incentives there? So the gap here was not like a fundamental understanding of whether incentives matter, but rather how do these things play out in a high stakes environment, a real world high stakes environment. And in a real world high stakes environment, almost always people get to choose their own teams. So we felt it would be artificial in this context to randomly assign teams. So what we needed were people who knew how to innovate, people with the skills. We needed something we could measure, a task that we could measure the performance of. We needed a real world setting, and we needed to be able to vary the incentive design workers faced. So we ended up partnering with Thermo Fisher, a large life science company, to run this. And we ran it within an innovation contest that they hosted, which was really exciting. And now we're working on a follow-up project to this with IGL. So I'm super excited. Some of my partners on that project are here. So the only thing we did was we maxed the team size at 3. I think that the decision underlying this is we felt like if the team sizes got to 8, for example, our incentives wouldn't be that meaningful. So if people were splitting the prize between 8 people, for example, it may not be so meaningful. But we also thought it would be very hard to measure our participation if that was the case. Otherwise, we didn't restrict team formation or anything like that. The only thing we varied is whether participants faced a winner takes all incentive design or a lower risk incentive structure with gradually higher prizes among the top 10.
Liz, about 2 minutes, and then we will
okay, and then
transfer
we'll
off. But thank you. You just answered a question that like 4 different people asked, so thank you.
Oh, nice. Okay. On top of the chat in my mind. We had no variation expected returns to participating, and we had large returns from performing well, which we thought was important. And this is really our goal takeaway. By implementing our experiment in the context of a high-profile firm-sponsored innovation contest that requires participants to develop a complete and novel product, our findings have direct implications for firm-directed innovation systems. And that was really our objective with this study and why we felt selection into teams was critical. So I have some notes on measurement. I'll share this after. What I want to get to in my last minute is just maybe some novel human subjects considerations when working with teams. The first, and I think this is always true, don't run the RCT if the benefits don't outweigh the costs. It's just a huge waste of resources. So always keep that in mind. The second is I try or I don't have any deception in my study. What this means is I don't tell them things that aren't true. And there's two reasons. First, I think deception can lead to behavior that doesn't generalize. In reality, managers typically don't lie to workers, or workers don't enter into agreements under false pretenses. And second, I think it reduces engagement. I do engage in incomplete disclosure about treatments. And when thinking through how much incomplete disclosure you might need, think through really how much do you need, and don't do any more than that. Disclose as much as you can. Give people free agency to make decisions for themselves. I think that's a freedom we all deserve. And then I think two other points: don't engage workers in activities that might threaten their earnings or their employment, especially when you're experimenting with them and organizations. Don't put them in situations where they might perform badly, artificially, or anything like that. Help them preserve their livelihood. You don't want to be responsible for that. Reduce hateful and hurtful speech. That's unique to team studies because you're probably observing communication or encouraging communication. Make sure that people are communicating fairly. And I'll wrap it up there. Thank you so much. This is so fun. I'm excited for your questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Liz. That last slide was great. Love that, particularly because of the team stuff. And we might talk a little bit more about this, but like getting comfortable with things like clinical equipoise and like actually understanding all the stuff that you're supposed to learn when you're doing the IRB, but maybe you click through too fast or whatever it is. Also, fun factoid, IRBs aren't necessarily there to make sure your study is ethical, right? Like that's actually not what they're there for. Right. And so I think engaging with these questions, particularly when we're going out into the field and particularly when we're working with teams, super important. So I just love that as a checklist. Thank you so much for sharing. Yana, I'm going to turn it over to you. You've got 25 minutes, and then we'll have about 20 minutes at the end for audience Q&A. Thank you, everybody, for just the awesome chat. Lots of great questions, lots of stuff that we'll tee up and ask live once Yana wraps. Yana, the floor is yours.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Rem. I'm excited to be here, and I'll jump straight in so that we don't lose any time. So let me get started here. Okay, there we go. So Rem, I entitled my talk "Feisty Field Experiments."
Oh, that is very good. You got to help us. CFXS, which no one can say quickly 3 times, right? We need you to help us rename.
And I'll talk a little bit about nuts and bolts as well. But Feisty, really, I have chosen this name, in fact, as you'll see in a moment, also for a class that I'm teaching and for my labs, because it does, a lot of the field experiments really require you to be feisty. And so I felt this was quite befitting. A bit of background before I jump in. So I did my PhD in economics, and now I'm a professor in strategy and in behavioral decision making at UCLA Anderson. And I saw somebody was sharing resources from UCLA IDRE. They have fantastic resources, especially if you're newer to doing analyses. I can highly recommend it. I saw that their coverage of like power analysis was shared in the chat. I endorse that a lot. Even when doing my PhD in Europe, which is where I did my PhD at the University of Zurich, I was pointed to the UCLA resources, and here I am. My focus of my research is on incentive design, and I've put a strong emphasis on non-monetary incentives, as you'll see in a moment, because just we lack understanding about how they work. Usually, and I really like that, Liz, you also pointed out like creativity. For me too, I like to be in this at the intersection of the Venn diagram, if you will, between creative and complex tasks like knowledge work, as well as pro-social behavior, because that's exactly where you encounter these difficult incentive problems. And I started running field experiments as a grad student. And now, as I mentioned, I'm running the Feisty Labs, where we have collaborated with different organizations that you can see here across different domains. So don't only look at for-profit companies, right? Think about also organizations as you see here, a prior partner was NASA in the public domain, but in the public service domain, but also voluntary organizations, right? So think a little systematically about organizations across the different sectors, depending on the question that you're interested in. And then I run this class now in its second year at the moment, where my MBA students are running field experiments with organizational partners. And that's been just a fantastic experience. We have so far had 100% success rate. Every team has been running a field experiment, all with different organizations. So if you're interested in this, we have a website, but you won't find that much information on there yet. Do feel free to reach out. I'll start the talk by giving you 2 quick examples of experiments, and I'll talk a bit about, just like Liz did, about the thoughts that went into those, and then I'll abstract a way to make a bit some broader points. The first experiment, Rem told me you had already mentioned it, so I'll include it here as well. So this is an experiment I ran with Wikipedia, this online encyclopedia that nobody knows and uses. And here, Wikipedia, is this public good is being provided to us by millions of volunteers around the world. And the encyclopedia faces one big issue, which is the editor retention. This is the figure that brought this problem on everybody's radar by Aaron Halfaker and co-authors, which shows the number of active Wikipedia contributors or editors or users, as they are sometimes called, and it's been declining. And that trend has just continued. And so I saw that, and I was a PhD student at the time. I saw that and I'm like, this is very interesting. You'll always see me, I motivate any study that I do with what's the problem, right? So here the problem in the field is contributor retention. But then it's not enough for an academic, right, at least, to have a problem in the field. Ideally, you want to have something that makes this context interesting from an academic perspective as well. So you'll see my second slide is always like, why is this context great from an academic perspective? I'll just focus here on 2 reasons. There are a few more, but one is it is an important global public good, and we are researchers, so we'd like to contribute and try to understand that more. But also, theoretically, this is a unique setting, was for me, for studying the effects of symbolic recognition. So I was very interested in studying the effects of awards and symbolic recognition incentives. The issue that I confronted as an economist was that whenever I would study this in organizational settings, people would say, oh, well, if you find that this award has a motivational effect and improves performance, you can't tell me this is because of the social recognition, because people might just be motivated by the bigger paycheck that they expect to get after the award, right? The promotion. So in most other organizational contexts, that was a major issue where it was, getting an award, of course, leads to further economic consequences, right? And so I would always get this response that this is very consistent with the Homo economicus, right? So that could be driven by just the underlying economic incentives that come along with these awards. And so the Wikipedia context was amazing for that reason, because people use pseudonyms. Most people, the vast majority, use pseudonyms, right? So I might be on Wikipedia Economist 123. You wouldn't know that I'm Jana Gallus. And so that was a key issue for me, because if I were able to, in this important context, to study a recognition incentive, an award, I would be able to make a fairly strong argument that any motivational effects I find are due to the social recognition and not to these effects on paychecks further, like down the road. A second aspect here, I didn't put this on the slide, but Liz, you said this, and with the online settings, Wikipedia is an amazing data source, right? So you can observe, and just a plug for those of you who are looking for interesting data to work with that are meaningful also, you find all the data on the actual editing behavior, like starting a new article, correcting typos and whatnot. In articles, you find everything timestamped, but you also find the behind the scenes, like what do people discuss, because everything is supposed to take place on Wikipedia. You have lots of different namespaces, as they are called. Some of them are really just there to discuss organizational rules, which is interesting for organizations scholars like myself. I've actually have another paper on this as well, on this very context, because it's such an amazing data source. Okay, so I found that context, and then I reached out to the community of Wikipedians and did a lot of networking and also learned qualitatively very important information about how this community works and how other language editions work. I was collaborating with the German language edition of Wikipedia, right? So I think this is another point that I'd like to make. This time that you put in before, and it's a lot of time that you put in, but you also just gain contextual understanding that is super important. And now, so there's sometimes a temptation to run fast, but I cannot emphasize this enough that you really understand what you need to understand from that social context, and that involves doing interviews, formal or informal, really almost becoming an embedded scholar if you can. And then you might also be able to run some surveys depending on the context. This is very costly. It is also always very risky, right? So there's always this trade-off between how much time should I put in now versus, first getting the results and then in hindsight trying to make sense of them. But I very much encourage everybody, because you also learn a lot that will serve you later on. As I mentioned, I've written another paper on this, right? And I keep having fantastic conversations and seeing ideas, think about ideas in this context, because I learned so much through these meetings. Try to get in-person meetings, even for studying Wikipedia. I made it a point to go to those offline roundtable meetings and meet the people behind the scenes, right? And so very much together with them, I developed this award scheme, which, by the way, was also important because, as sociologists might tell you, you need to have prestige in order to confer prestige, right? So coming in as an outsider, no-name newcomer on Wikipedia and handing out these awards would not have cut it, right? I mean, I would have studied something, but the construct that I'm interested in would be very different from what I would have been studying, right? Some randomly handed out awards. So I worked together with the community and then created this Edelweiss Award. This was within the portal Switzerland. You see it here, using the standard awards language. I'll be faster on this. It's in the paper if you're interested in it. I think it's actually still online even. And then there's the award board that explained, like, gave you the background, very much made it look like a national award because it was embedded in the portal Switzerland. And there, where you see XYZ at the bottom, you would always see that given month's award recipients' pseudonyms, right? And so the quick question was, did the symbolic awards raise newcomer retention specifically? So this award was given to newcomers, anybody who had made some first valuable contributions. And of course, what did I do? I randomized who would get it and who would stay in the control group and wouldn't hear about this award. And so, yes, I found that there were significant effects on subsequent retention. In the following month, it raised the retention rate by 20%, highly significant. I'll not go into the details here. There's lots of other findings. The effects persisted, in fact, for an entire year. Happy to talk about that offline. Afterwards, why. And I also was then able to use some of the data, for example, from what people posted underneath the award to get at the mechanisms question, right? But in this experiment, and in fact, this is an advice I want to give more broadly, is I try to stay focused. In this experiment, I had two groups. One is the control group, one is the treatment group, right? Of course, in the next experiment that I'm running, I'll do like three, right? I'll also have a private feedback group, right? To disentangle a bit more the mechanisms. I would, though, I think this advice is, especially if you're starting with experiments, don't get too greedy. Don't start running like 5 different treatment arms with the control, because power is real, statistical power, right? And so we always, all of us, now I'm going on a limb, but I'm pretty confident about this. We have these temptations of like, oh, if I had this additional arm, I would also be able to benchmark and do whatever. The problem is, at the end of the day, you'll be underpowered and you don't have anything, right? So try to focus and think very, very carefully about what you really need in that first experiment, for example, right? And then try to think, what other data sources could you use to get more to the mechanisms, which is that's what we call the why question, right? So why did it have said effects? In this case, and I go through this in the paper, something that came out very strongly is this sense of belonging and identifying as a part of the community. That seems to have been one key mechanism. A second experiment, very different, and I deliberately chose these very different kinds here. We ran this, and this was led by Joey Reeve and Justin Zhang. We ran a field experiment with physicians. And this is now in the context of a major hospital system in the US, namely UCLA Health. And the problem that we focused on here, this is the problem slide again, is motivating preventive care, but doing so under constraints. Right? So there's a lot of efforts in the system to motivate physicians to do more preventive care, to catch things early. At the same time, we all know, especially post-pandemic, that physician burnout is a real concern. Right? So we had primary focus was on, can we motivate more preventive care? And the secondary variable that we also measured was well-being at work, notably burnout and job satisfaction. And what made this context not only practically meaningful, but also relevant from a research perspective is that we had data on two important sets of outcomes, preventive care, as well as the thing that's oftentimes unmeasured, and this is well-being at work, right? Because they had been running a survey, and they still are, where they always measured quarterly well-being, so job satisfaction and burnout. So that was a bit made, and this survey has above 90% response rate. So we had a good measure on these usually immeasurables. And also this time we were able to have a third condition to start getting at the mechanisms, explore the mechanisms. Okay. Now the experiment in a nutshell, it ended up being a 5-month field experiment because guess what happened in March 2020? COVID. But that was okay. We had pre-registered a longer time period, but everybody understood that we had to stop it here. We didn't even reach a decision. This was exogenous. Also, by the way, when I say natural field experiment, I'm referring to a wonderful taxonomy. I saw that some people had asked about this by Harrison and List 2004. Natural field experiment here refers to the fact that people in the field are not aware that there is an experiment taking place. So you get around these observer effects that might interact in weird ways with the treatments that you're studying, and that would be an issue, right? So people don't know that there is an experiment happening behind the scenes. Don't confuse this with natural experiment, which is a separate thing, right? So it's still a field experiment where we come in and randomize. We had 3 conditions, which we cluster randomized at the clinic level in this case. So you see, very different from Wikipedia, where I randomized at the individual level. And the conditions were a control group. They just get their personal score. That's this, basically, think of it as the preventive care score. Out of the test that you should have been telling your patients to go do, let's say mammogram, how many did you do, right? How many did you order, and then how many did the patients complete? That's what at baseline, all the physicians had been getting emails about, part of a larger incentive program. And then we had 2 treatment groups. The first one just added peer comparison. Where are you in the performance distribution, so to speak, and then also a spotlight on the top 25 physicians. And the third one had exactly the peer comparisons, but on top of this had a leadership training intervention that made, where the main purpose was to convey that this was a joint effort from the system to improve preventive care and why it's important. And I'll be short again. Did this peer comparison intervention significantly improve preventive care performance? That was our main interest. Nope. The answer is no, we don't find any significant effects on performance. Also, no heterogeneity depending on baseline performance. So really nothing here to think there was an effect. But it did significantly affect well-being at work, and it did so for the worse. Right? So you see here it lowered job satisfaction significantly, even after the intervention had been pulled, and it increased burnout. And I do want to emphasize these were secondary dependent variables, right? So these were not the primary dependent variables. And that's something we can talk about more also, what do you do, right? With these, a null on your main dependent variable, and then maybe interesting exploratory findings on the secondary dependent variables. And we then jumped into this in the paper. You'll see us do this also almost detective work, right? What led to the backfiring? I'll keep this as a cliffhanger. I won't actually go into it because this is not the main purpose of the talk here. So zooming out, let me tell you about what I see as 3 different approaches to running field experiments. The first one is what I think most people do and think about when we talk about field experiments, and certainly what most of my students in my Feisty class, the MBA students, are doing. These are institutional experiments, as I would call them, which means you're partnering with an existing organization. And again, remember, there's like the private sector, yes, but there's also nonprofit and public sector organizations that might be very interested in running experiments with you, especially if they don't have the capacity in-house, by the way. So that's what we usually see. But then there's also the second one tier is, or not tier, these are not tiers, right? Those are just distinct types. Community embedded experiments. And in fact, I will say I don't see enough of those. It's like, that's the Wikipedia experiment. Why don't I see enough of those? Well, probably for good reasons. They're really hard to pull off because you don't have one head whom you need to convince. It's like lots of people. You're running this with a community, right? And they are extremely interesting, though, if we think about also crowd-based innovation. Those are really interesting contexts that where oftentimes you as a researcher coming in really have something to add. Also, I will say, as I mentioned, I was a PhD student back in the times. Would NASA have run a field experiment with me, as I later did? Probably not, if it's just me. And it was just me, right? So here, and this might be also something to the credit of Wikipedia, right? Where they don't care about your titles. I had none, but really just took it for the idea's worth, right? And for whether you were committed and show commitment. So that's something to keep in mind. There are communities out there. Maybe you can run a community embedded experiment with the risk that it entails. The third aspect, the third type or approach to running field experiments is what I call bootstrapped experiments. And I've been talking about this with my students as well in the Feisty class, because if everything falls through, well, then let's bootstrap this experiment, right? And let's think about, can we set up an organization? Can we have a task that we really need help for and run this? Or there are other examples. For instance, I had shared somehow I have a lot of John List plugs in here, but for a good reason. So John has this also, he had this early publication, right, where he would show up at these card trading shows and then run experiments there, set up a table himself. And there's other experiments like that, right? If you think about actually these audit or correspondence studies where people sent out resumes, right? That's effectively bootstrapped, right? You don't need an organization to partner with you. And they just varied like the names, the first name and the characteristic, the traits that this would signal, right? Is it a man or a woman? Those are these audit and correspondence studies. Okay, and so those are the three types of theory approaches to running field experiments. You also, and I heard Liz actually talked about this, so I will be short on this, but something that I saw come out very clearly in my class too, is that really at a high level, we have two approaches to identifying field partners and deciding on who to work with. One is what I'd call a programmatic approach, where you have a question and then that guides your partner search. And in fact, you can come up with my students. We have, in fact, a template for a spreadsheet as to what are the specifications that the ideal field partner fulfills. And then you say, okay, we need the partner to have X, Y, Z. So for example, for Wikipedia, to be able to study purely symbolic recognition. What does that mean, right? Ideally, some context where people use pseudonyms, for example, right? And so you identify the criteria. And then you say, okay, now let's think about systematically, let's scope out the universe of field partners or bootstrapped methods and communities. Who is there? And then you can start really establishing your spreadsheet and developing a plan for reaching out to those organizations. In most cases, there are more than one organization, right? And so that's great, because then you can start thinking systematically about how do we get the partner. During COVID, the first peak of COVID, I had with several students and my back then research assistant, we had a massive sheet of organizations that we wanted to reach out to in order to study symbolic incentives. We ended up running an experiment with the American Red Cross, but there were lots of other organizations, even to the Catholic Church, that we had on our spreadsheet to like reach out to. So that's the programmatic approach. You have a question, you can say exactly, this is what we need from the partner. And I'll talk a bit more about this in a second. The other approach is opportunistic, where you have a partner and then you think about, is there a question that both of us, back to the Venn diagram, find interesting, right? That's hard, but it's not impossible. And I think we can have a discussion about this. I actually think if you have a really committed field partner, talk to them and talk to them as much as possible. Do a lot of background research and think creatively and take a bit of a distance and think back. Is there something you could do? Because commitment on the part of a field partner is priceless if they also fulfill a few other criteria. And that's now what I get to. Key questions to ask on your first calls, like the first 1 or 2 calls. First, you want to get at the question, are they open to random assignment? And well, actually be careful that everybody understands what random means, because it's actually funny how many misperceptions there are about what random actually is. Ideally, that's why I put this in parentheses, do the random assignment yourself. I have a lot of things to say about this. I won't, but one thing that I do want to say, you don't want to confront them with, by the way, we'll just randomize your employees. Let's do it. Are you in? That's not the most sensitive approach for doing this, because I mean, some people get freaked out when you mention random. So you need to talk about this a little more carefully and have a plan for how to talk about it. Second point, do they even have the data that you need? To Liz's point, presentation from earlier, right? Ideally, even share a data shell with them to get their heads, to get everybody on the same page for what data you will need, right? At the individual level, and what would it look like? What's the must? What's the should? What's the could? Kind of variables here that can be really helpful and speed up a lot of things and get rid of a lot of misunderstandings. Then, do you have a large enough sample, right? You want to do power analysis. Don't just do one power analysis, do several, right? Because it's actually, there's a science, but it's a lot of art as well. And then, are they committed enough? As I said before, ideally, in fact, have one champion on the inside who's responsible. Ideally, that doesn't always happen, but that's ideally what you do. Now, in the interest of time, I know I have like 7 minutes or something like that. Just if you think about the life cycle of an experiment, let me touch on a few things before I get to the pre-mortem, which you'll see in here. So first, you establish the partnership, right? Do think carefully also about legal matters. I mean, honestly, I hate thinking about this. It's like, for me, the most boring stuff, but it's super important. I've heard of many instances where people got close and lost access to all data and so on. You might have even run an experiment and you lose access to the data. And if you're a PhD student, this can ruin your career, right? So really careful about this. I mentioned the point about doing qualitative work too at that stage, right? And maybe consistently. Then experimental design. There are a few, like 3 key questions that I tell my students to keep on their minds is like, what's your dependent variable, or OEC as it's sometimes called, overall evaluation criterion. This is like Ron Kohavi and so on, who has amazing work too and pieces. Then how do you randomize? And then what's the timeline of the experiment? Yeah, there are a few more points in here that I won't mention now. Pilots, why do you do pilots? Think about it. Do you need it mostly nowadays? I think it's mostly useful for these operational issues, not so much for power analysis. Like for is there there? Because at the end of the day, it is a power analysis. It's underpowered. It's a pilot. It's underpowered. Then data generation, stand ready for questions, plan this through, make sure that you have the bandwidth when you go live. You will really need, in most cases, a lot of time, and be there no matter where you are. I could tell you some backstories about how I was sitting on some island when I finally took vacation as a PhD student and was like responding, and like there are pictures of me on the beach doing my experiments. And then the data stuff. I want a cleaning and analysis and so on. And also, importantly, reporting back to the partner, right? Because it is an ongoing relationship, and also other researchers behind you might be interested in doing this. So it's a public good in a way from researchers. The pre-mortem you want to ideally do before you really implement the experiment, right? So what is a pre-mortem? It means before things have failed, you put on your hindsight hat and you put yourself into the shoes of 3 or 4 months out, and the project has spectacular spectacularly failed. And then you want to identify the, let's say, 5 key reasons why that was. Right? It hasn't yet happened. That's why it's a pre and not a post-mortem. But it's really important for addressing overconfidence, but also groupthink. Usually we work with people whom we like working together with. And so there's this hesitancy. Nobody wants to be the person who says, "Ooh, but I think this is not quite as great as everybody makes it up." Or as everybody says it is, right? So this can help identify key issues. And then why would you do that? Ideally, you want to think about things that you can change before it's too late to minimize the likelihood of failure. You might also want to think about, well, if this is really a highly risky endeavor and there's nothing you can do about these key risks that are out there, then especially if you're starting out in your career, you may want to have a backup plan, right? And may want to think about your time allocation as a function of, the likely risks that are involved. And then one thing that I would put in here as from researcher's perspective, think about also if you end up with a null result, there's no significant treatment effect on your main outcome variable. Is there anything you could have done differently to make this actually insightful? Okay, very important so that you can use the data from this experiment, ideally even to write up a meaningful paper that adds to our common understanding, right? And I've shared a link to one website. I know I'm zooming out in a moment to one how shall I say, platform where you can run these expert prediction for these forecasting tournaments, right? That's one interesting way of making null results interesting if relevant audiences, let's say researchers, or I saw Rem, your great point in there, right? Or maybe people, managers in the field, if they would have thought this will have a significant and a strong treatment effect, and you can show that at least their effect size, you can rule out that there was, with a fair degree of confidence, that there was any effect, right? That makes a null result insightful. That's one way of doing this. So now I'm zooming out. The 3 key messages that I want to convey here is first, that there are different approaches to getting a field experiment off the ground, right? So do think broadly. If you want to do field experiments, and Liz has covered why field experiments are such an amazing methodology. I also just find them personally extremely gratifying, even the failures, I will say, even though they are painful. So if you want to get into running field experiments, think broadly about how you could do this. Be creative. Maybe there's something that nobody else has done yet, right? Like a completely different approach. Develop a plan. Don't put all your eggs in a basket if you intend to stay in academia. I might even say don't put all your eggs into the field experiments basket, because even you might have, like, I don't know, everybody has 24 hours in a day. You might have a set number of field experiments live, but then they might all fail. You don't know. I don't think you'll be able to run as many experiments as it takes to be sure that there will be your one job market paper in there. So you might want to think about different also approaches potentially, or maybe you get brought onto field experiments that are a bit further along where there's something interesting there. Get clarity from your partner early on. For instance, will you be able to do random assignment? And then do push yourself to doing a pre-mortem about what are the 5 things that could lead to project failure with your hindsight hat.
I love those 3 messages, Jana. Perfect note to end on. I want to make sure we've got roughly 20 minutes for Q&A at the end. Thank you so much, both. Those were awesome. I have lots of notes. I learned a lot. So we're going to open up to questions. If you have questions that you want to ask, you can just keep your raise the hand button on. Would be absolutely great. There was one that I wanted to start with. Let me see if I can find from Liz on the failures. Ya Chang, are you still here?
Yes. Hi.
Yeah, could you ask your question? Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for the presentation. It was really, really helpful. My name is Ya Chen. I'm currently in Singapore, and it's already the evening. So, this is actually a question for both of the speaker today, both Leon's and Gaius, because most of the time when we conduct our first experiment, we're all talking about failures. Could you elaborate what kind of failures you have experienced during the process, and what's the takeaways and how you dealt with it, especially together with a firm, because there is a cost towards even the community or the organization. Thank you so much.
I can start, Anna, and then I've never had a failure in the sense that like the experiment got run the way we envisioned it to get run, and I didn't like the results. I mean, whenever it gets run, and we get results that, as Yana said, tells us something new relative to, which is always, for me, it's been a success. So the failures have been earlier, like in the implementation collapsed, or yeah, the partner and I had different visions. I think Yana's points on how to set expectations early can save you so much time. So the failures have much more been around that. The one exception, the thing I feel, there was nothing I could do about, but I feel so sad about it. I was running a study with the World Bank in Afghanistan on girls' education right before COVID. And we got a baseline that ran throughout the country, which was really novel to get girls' opinions in Afghanistan throughout the country. And it was really on how to increase the supply of skilled workers in the country. And then COVID shut the schools down, and then the girls' schools never reopened because of the Taliban. So that was a horrific failure, but I don't have any regrets about it. I think as long as you go in and at each step, you feel at that moment you're making the right decisions, you're not going to have regrets. But I know you also have time constraints, and that might lead you to feel you've made a failure if you waste time. So I think Yana's advice on how to like really fail quickly, it's almost like running a startup. Like, fail quickly, get informed, don't be afraid of information, don't be afraid of being told you're wrong, because that way you're going to save like so much time.
Yeah. Piggybacking off of that, I think so. I will say I have had failures even afterwards, and my advice that I shared here guided some of this. So, for example, the importance of sharing a data shell. I mean, do I do this all the time? No, frankly not, because sometimes we just don't have the time, or we work with an organization where it's clear they have everything, right? I mean,
So,
think of
Yana, just a quick question. I guessed on what you meant by data shell, but could you explain what you mean by data shell?
oh yeah,
It was
yeah.
a
So
question
it's
came up.
basically, almost you could provide a spreadsheet where you say, these are my variables that I want in the columns, and then these are the rows. This is individual one. You can even go to this point, like this is, so of course I do not want any names from people. Also make that clear, because you can get emails where suddenly there's identifiable information in there, and you're like, oh, no, 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 no. So make clear, this is the unique identifier one, right? So this stands for a person. You can have a call and walk through this. This is actually also, we always want to think about what helps, what is adding value to the organization too. And this kind of walking them through it is actually something that I have found field partners to really enjoy. It's like, oh, this is interesting. We want to be a learning organization. This is how we can think about data. This is how it could look, what it could look like. And then so you want to walk them through. These are the kinds of variables. This is exactly what the variable value could look like, right? And then you can also color code it by saying, this is what we absolutely need, because if we don't have this, we really won't know anything. And this is what would be nice to have, but we understand if you don't have the data, can't pull it, it's too intensive. You want to keep the work on the field partner as low as possible. You might even want to have an organizational insider who can do all of that for you if you can. So basically a PhD student who starts working with the company, right? And becomes the insider. So I've had a case where we ran an experiment, and it was for us clear that we had understood what data we needed verbally, but then, and this was all like short notice, there were timelines that had to be met. We basically we said, okay, let's just try it. And then it turned out that there was a misunderstanding from jointly, right, about what we really need. And so we ended up just having to stay at an aggregate level, and was impossible to make anything out of this. There are other cases where, I've had now, we just launched an experiment that we have been working on since 2017. And we had started, I don't want to disclose organizational identities here, but we had started, there are basically two organizations out there in the world who could be relevant field contexts. And we'd started there, had our organizational champion, then there was intra-organizational turnover, person left, and we're done. So we go over to the next, we get our in on that second organization. We have somebody we work on, even we had the tool programmed up. And then there was some PR kerfuffle that they got involved in, had nothing to do with us, wasn't even close to what we were interested in. But the organization gets cold feet, don't want to do anything that's not standard and not part of their usual business as usual, right? And so they pulled out. And then our partner left anyway. And now we're back at the first organization, but we're bootstrapping it. So like where we have all the control, right? But this is
You
like,
will fail so much. There's a book that I like by Dean Carlin,
yes,
another co-author,
failing in the
Failing
field.
in the Fields. Yeah. Great,
Yeah.
worth reading. We could go, like, these are important to share. This is why we do this. So wonderful question. I want to make sure we get a couple more in. Christina, I saw your hand up. Question from you.
Yeah, actually, I had a couple, but I'll limit to sort of what brought me to this course in the first place, which is, say you're coming at this not as a new researcher per se, but with a whole toolkit of other skills. And what are the pitfalls that someone like me, who has been doing a different approach to research for a very long time, what am I gonna blow soonest, worst? Like where do you know where my cognitive holes are? Because I'm like so committed to this and terrified.
I can just say what I've seen co-authors of mine, like yourself, struggle with. So one is like setting up the experiment with no degrees of freedom. So you're like, sure, like you have no variation left because you're kind of like, I had a co-author who was like, no, but we know we want this outcome. So let's design the experiment specific, and there's no other outcome we could get. So I think allowing, like you're looking at intention to treat or average treat. And so some of the mess is like part of the process. And then the other, I think, to Anna's point is like, you're not necessarily going to be able to measure everything as maybe you can do in big surveys like you run. And so thinking about what do we need and then what would be nice to have, and compromising, because really you're trading off like causal identification on a question you care about with, being able to run, 100 analysis to support a take. So I think thinking through compromise on what variation am I comfortable with and what measures can I sacrifice will be important.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I would just add briefly that the amount of time that goes into the social aspect about like talking to the field partners at all steps, and also being beholden to, being subject to whatever is going on in the organization, because the experiment is not their priority, right? So the IQ, but also EQ, and giving back to the organization, sometimes actually doing stuff that's not at all what you want to do, but it's, an investment in the relationship, that whole relationship building for every single field partner. I think that's something that we still underestimate, the time that it takes and the cognitive resources that it actually takes.
Yeah, I'll add just quickly there, and then Yang, I'm going to go to you for a question. As I see your hand up, which is that small one cognitively that I know I have blinders on, particularly if you're working with larger organizations, can be the legal stuff, because you just don't know, and you don't even know what to ask. And so, like, if you're going in with a DUA or an NDA or a contract, find someone who's been there. Reach out in your network, right? Even if you're doing observational analysis, often the terms of the deal can be different. And that's one where, even as an experimentalist, I've had less experience on that because most of my experiments have been bootstrapped. So I had to sign an NDA with myself. It was fine. Like, there was no problem, right? But when you're working with some of these larger organizations, that's something where I think we often just don't have the language. You can also get tripped up with the lawyers in your university. Because if you go with them and you use the wrong word, they're going to be like, oh, you can't do this. And literally it's just because you misdescribed what you were doing. And then they're like, oh, yeah, this is totally fine. So that's just like a big concrete one that I think if you're entering into field experiments, you're going to both be really good at going to dinner with people, and you're going to become a lawyer, right? Those are two skills that I don't think you necessarily gain if you're crunching, words data in Stata. Yang.
Hi, thank you very much. So my question is connected to this. So yeah, but first of all, I'm young. I'm based in Amsterdam. Thank you very much. and I am a PhD student in entrepreneurship, and I study startup employees. And my question is such that startups are highly heterogeneous, and we need to involve more than one to capture the multi-phased nature of the context, as well as you may know, startups are also very lean, so there's not many people there. So my question is like, how would you advise to strategically set up the selection criteria, which kind of like organizations that we could reach out to ensure the ecological validity, as well as do you have any extra thoughts on administratively, it's rather impossible to sign so many like legal contracts with so many different little startups. So that's it.
Maybe some additional, so are you thinking that you want to run experiments within many startups, or you want the startup to be the unit of observation?
So it's great point. Of course, we would like to find a generalized rule applying for as many startups as possible, ecologically. Whereas at the same time, operation-wise, startups usually, they have 20 to 50 people. The power-wise, it's impossible to only include one. So at least we would need like 4 to 5. So I would say like then, and at the same time, startups are more heterogeneous than like very mature organizations. So I would say, would you recommend, for example, to strategically set the criteria and selection to set up this kind of like ecological
I will
validity?
jump in quickly, just if you don't
Yeah.
mind, Liz and Yana, on the one. I think you have to ask yourself, based off their excellent presentations, like, do you need ecological validity? Like, does that matter? Right. And I have a project that's taken 2 years where we like spent way too much time thinking about ecological validity. And then like someone like raised their hand, we did the pre-mortem, and it turns out like this was a huge amount of effort for something that no one really cares about. Like that part of the paper did not hinge on anything. The second one I would say is think of platforms that startups already use. So are there accelerators? Are there tools like Shopify that they're already on that you can use to expand the N? I think that's huge. Getting individual startups to try to get that in. Come next week, we'll have Kiara. You should definitely be there for that one. They have been able to get lots of startups by working with universities, accelerators, others. That might be another useful way to sort of unpack that problem. But I think it goes back to exactly what Liz and Yana were saying, which is that like it comes back to the research question. Right. Like, and I think thinking about how the trade-offs on the research question map to that's first, right? Versus just saying like, let me get the perfect sample, because there is no perfect sample. It actually really depends on the situation and the research question. Okay, so we've got time for probably 2 more questions. Luke, you had one about how to pare down experiments that I liked, and then Moritz will be our final question of the session today.
You want me to jump in?
Yeah, please.
You said like plan for a very ambitious experiment. So say your N is, I don't know, 1,000, but recognize it's probably going to drop quickly, and you should have a plan for how to drop some of your arms. So I'm just unsure of how you say you had a 2x2 and you start running it and your numbers aren't coming in. How do you plan to drop some arms? Or is it if you're treating 4 different groups differently, for example?
Yeah, how do you go from being greedy to not greedy, Yana and Liz, in terms of experimental design?
I think Yana's point about talking to maybe not your target population, because you might bias them by but like people like your or whatever, or even your target, depending on, is so helpful, because so when you write your grant application, you haven't spent any money potentially, right? You're just very speculative, based on theory and literature, and then you get money, and I would spend some of that money going to figure out what really matters, and that can quite quickly help you understand what the fundamental question is, and then you focus on that. Or you might realize, no, I need that 2x2, and that I don't have enough money, or I have gone back to funders and said, like, this experiment doesn't make sense if we don't have more funding. And generally they're like, well, we'd rather have something than nothing. So, but we don't know that until we talk to them, or until we get a better understanding of our setting. So pilots help, talking to people help, everything Yana said about like getting a really strong feel for things up front. And
Okay, so you're not adapting. you're not adapting in the middle of running it. This is a
No.
pre-type decision.
Yes. You can't, I mean, you might want to increase sample size of one group more than you expected during, but generally dropping a treatment during can make it really impossible to analyze your results, for example. But also, again, think about your research question and why it's interesting in academia, not just in the field. And if the question that ends up being interesting in the field just isn't relevant academically, maybe rethink the setting or something like that.
And one more thing is that first we tend to we tend to be too optimistic in general in terms of treatment effect size and so on, because you just designed this intervention. So how couldn't it have the high treatment effect? Especially, I feel like if we're starting out running experiments, afterwards we become much, hopefully, more realistic. But the second thing is that this is also a question that you have to think through very carefully. And I did not emphasize this, even though it was in the experimental timeline, in the pre-registration. I know you'll be talking about this further down in this program, right? So you want to think about carefully, might you want to have your primary test collapse 2 of the cells, right? And then you say, if this is statistically significant, only if we'll also analyze the other contrast. It depends on the theory, right? But this is something that you need to spell out and think through very carefully in the pre-registration too.
Great. Last question, Martz. I know we are out of time, so hit us with it.
Yes.
Thank you so much, everybody.
I have a short question for Jana. So you said about the importance of random assignment. I already have a company, and what do you think about self-randomization? So the user can decide by him or herself if they want to do it or not, if they want to take it or not, if they want to whatever.
Oh, that's interesting. So it depends on how, I'm not sure I fully understand self-randomization, but you don't want the users to be able to select into one or the other conditions, because that's like, then you have the selection, the endogeneity bias, right? That you need to assign them randomly, right? That's the kind of the power horse of the field experiment, which gets around the selection bias. Now, maybe your question was about, or what the partner is proposing is that users can then decide. So they are in one or the other group, and they can decide.
And then they can decide
whether they want to do the program or not. Yeah, so then that's where you get to the questions of take up. And, it's possible that people are in your treatment group, they get invited to a program, but nobody comes. And in fact, we overestimate, I think, oftentimes the degree to which people will actually take it when you offer it. So that's something you need to think about very carefully also for the power analysis and about the analytical strategy. So Liz was mentioning very briefly in between, we don't have the time to cover this, but what I would suggest is to look up intent to treat analysis, because you may need to run the analysis on everybody who was originally allocated into one of the arms, regardless of whether or not they actually take up the program, whether they like really go to the sessions, let's say, or not.
Yeah.
That's a little more, I know we're over time, so that I can't speak a little more to this, but definitely look it up, intent to treat and what you can do. I hope this is kind of what you're.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you. I dropped a paper also by one of my colleagues, Chris Stanton, where they randomized the ability to self-select into treatment, which is like super interesting. And so lots you can do with that, but agreed, you still need randomization. If everybody's self-selecting, you don't have an experiment, maybe you've got something interesting.